When I arrived at my ex's wedding, I expected invisible stitches holding the whole awkward affair together. What I didn't expect was to be seated beside the maid of honor, a woman my ex had described with the same bland resentment she saved for sushi chefs and old boyfriends. That seating chart was designed to humiliate me. Instead, it handed me the most unexpected ally in the room, and no one saw my response coming. My name is Adam. When my ex-fiancée invited me to her wedding, I knew it wasn't for closure. It was for one last display of control. She paired me with Julia, her maid of honor, a woman she dismissed as blandly as she once dismissed me. The plan was quiet humiliation. The result was anything but. Her name was Claire. We had been together for 6 years, engaged for 2. She ended it 6 months before the wedding because, in her words, I made the future feel too finished. What she meant was that I didn't provide enough drama, and she had confused chaos with passion. The year after, I rebuilt a life around silences that were actually mine. New apartment, old books, friends who had been patiently waiting for me to stop apologizing for her absence. When the invitation came, cream cardstock with gold lettering and her new fiancé's name embossed like a promotion, I almost laughed. It was a test. If I declined, I was still wounded. If I accepted, I was walking into a room designed to remind me of everything I no longer had. I chose to go, because I refused to let a woman who'd already rewritten our history write the final chapter without me in the room. The venue was a restored dairy barn 40 minutes outside the city, chandeliers dripping from exposed beams, farm tables set with porcelain that cost more per setting than my first rent. Every detail was Claire, meticulous, staged, and curated to project a life she'd finally gotten right. I arrived alone, wearing a suit I'd bought specifically for the occasion because showing up in anything less than armor would have been its own surrender. The seating chart was posted on a vintage mirror near the entrance. I traced my name to table 12, wedged near the service door, miles from the family and college friends. And directly beside the only other person in the room who looked like she'd received the same unspoken summons. Her name was Julia Vance, the maid of honor. I'd only heard Julia's name in Claire's voice before, always tinted with the condescension she reserved for women who threatened her without trying. Julia was an architect, perpetually single in the way Claire described as if it were a chronic condition. She'd been assigned the role not out of affection but efficiency. Someone had to manage the vendors while the bridesmaids managed their Instagram captions. As I sat down, Julia glanced at me with the weary understanding of a person who'd already deciphered the seating chart and found it just as petty as I had. We traded clipped niceties. The salad arrived. The toast started, one after another praising Claire for finally finding her person, the weight of the implications settling over our table like a fog only we could feel. Julia's jaw tightened. I cataloged the same small humiliations, recognizing in her stillness the specific exhaustion of being treated as a prop in someone else's production. But here's the thing about a room that expects you to shrink. It hands you a strange freedom. When the DJ shifted from dinner jazz into something reckless, a song Claire once told me was too loud to be romantic, I felt the crowd's attention pivot. They were waiting for me to retreat to the bar, to confirm every pitying glance with a quiet exit. Instead, I set down my whiskey, turned toward Julia, and offered my hand. The room went silent. Claire's new husband's arm tightened possessively around her waist, and Julia, after one suspended heartbeat, placed her fingers in mine. The music swallowed us whole, not the polite, choreographed kind Claire had approved for the cocktail hour. This was something older, louder, the sort of song that makes walls feel temporary. I don't remember the title. I remember the bass line catching Julia's shoulders first, a small, involuntary movement she tried to hide. That involuntary was everything. It told me she'd been suppressing herself in this room for hours. We stepped onto the floor, and the crowd parted with the clumsy instinct of people who sense a scene, but don't yet know which kind. Claire's new husband, Derek, a man whose LinkedIn profile had more charisma than his presence, tightened his arm around Claire as if I were about to charge the head table. But I wasn't watching him. I was watching Julia, who moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had been taught to apologize for taking up space and had finally stopped believing the lesson. The first 30 seconds were just dancing, the easy, mechanical kind two strangers manage at a party neither of them chose. Then I leaned close, not for privacy, but because the moment demanded something public. The nearest guests had already abandoned their own conversations. Forks hovered unmoving over untouched plates. "I spent years trying to earn a seat at a table like this," I said, my voice steady enough to carry over the fatting chorus. But the best chair turned out to be the one she assigned me without knowing what I'd do with it. Julia's laugh broke through the room like a window opening in a stale house. It was sudden, unguarded, and so genuine that 3 different heads swiveled toward Claire to see how the bride was taking it. Claire's smile had calcified into something you'd hang in a museum labeled asterisk pleasant hostess, circa discomfort asterisk. Derek looked confused, which struck me as his baseline expression. That laugh accomplished what 12 speeches hadn't. It made Julia the center of the room, not as a prop, but as a person who had just been handed permission to exist outside the narrative Claire had written. We kept dancing, and now the whispers around us were different. No longer pitying, just curious. A few guests were even smiling, the renegades who'd secretly hoped this wedding would deliver something more interesting than open-bar small talk. Julia looked up at me, dark eyes still holding the light from that laugh. "You know she told everyone you'd either not show up or get drunk and embarrass yourself." Her voice was quiet, conspiratorial. She had money on it, literally a betting pool among the bridesmaids. I felt something shift in my chest, not anger. I'd exhausted my anger at Claire months ago, but a clean, clarifying certainty. What were the odds? 4-1 against you showing. 6-1 you'd make a scene in the wrong way. She paused, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder as the tempo slowed. "No one bet on this." The song faded. I didn't let go. Instead, I walked back to the table, retrieved my whiskey glass, and raised it toward the head table with the deliberate calm of a man who'd finally stopped trying to understand a woman he'd never really known. "A toast," I said, and the room went silent with the precision of a door slamming. I met Claire's eyes. "To the bride and groom. May you always receive exactly what you intended, and a little more than you expected." It was a kindness that tasted like freedom. The kind you offer not because the recipient deserves it, but because you've become a person who can afford to be generous. Claire's expression flickered, gratitude struggling with the unmistakable sting of being handed something sharper than she'd prepared for. Beside her, Derek leaned over and whispered something. She shook her head once quick, like a horse shooing a fly. But the real reward wasn't Claire's discomfort. It was the way Julia touched her glass to mine after I sat back down. A soft clink that said, "I see exactly what you just did asterisk." That small gesture rewired the rest of the night. Over the next 30 minutes, the table dynamic transformed. The other guests stopped treating us like a quarantine zone. A groomsman who'd been aggressively neutral all evening suddenly wanted my opinion on bourbon. One of the bridesmaids, a woman whose loyalty had apparently run out around the 3rd round of seating chart revisions, leaned over and whispered to Julia, "I always thought she was threatened by you." Julia's face said she'd known that for years but had never heard it confirmed out loud. Then Julia told me something that reframed every earlier assumption. Claire hadn't just seated me beside the maid of honor to be petty. She'd done it because 6 months before the breakup, she and Julia had been finalists for the same architectural fellowship, a prestigious position that would have launched Julia's career internationally. Claire, whose own application was weaker, had contacted the selection committee anonymously, spreading rumors about Julia's professionalism. It was a calculated demolition, executed with the surgical precision I remembered too well. When I left Claire, I'd believed the cruelty was reserved for romantic partners. Now I understood it was simply who she was. She didn't want me as her maid of honor, Julia said, tracing the rim of her glass. She wanted me as her employee, someone she could give instructions to and watch perform gratitude. The seating chart was a bonus. That revelation changed the stakes entirely. This wasn't just a bitter ex's power play. It was a pattern. Claire collected people she could control and arranged them in rooms like evidence of her own stability. The ones who escaped, me, Julia, were meant to return and confirm she'd been right to discard us. I was about to respond when a shadow fell over the table. Derek stood there, loosening his tie with the kind of practiced casualness that signals a man preparing for a confrontation he hasn't earned. "Nice toast," he said, the words landing flat like a dart thrown by someone who'd only read about the game. "But you're still the guy she didn't marry." Derek stood there, loosening his tie with the kind of practiced casualness that signals a man preparing for a confrontation he hasn't earned. "Nice toast," he said, the words landing flat like a dart thrown by someone who'd only read about the game. "But you're still the guy she didn't marry." The sentence hung in the air, waiting for me to flinch. I didn't. Years of Claire's passive aggression had vaccinated me against blunt instruments. I set my glass down and looked at him the way you'd examine a piece of furniture that had mistaken itself for an opponent. "That's true," I said. "I am the guy she didn't marry. And you're the guy she settled for 6 months after destroying 2 careers and calling it self-care. Congratulations. You're the promotion she gave herself." Derek's face did something complicated, a brief, involuntary spasm that revealed he'd heard something he already knew but hoped no one else had noticed. The table behind us went quiet. Julia didn't look away from me, but her expression sharpened with the recognition of a fellow survivor. Claire materialized at Derek's elbow the way she always had, too late to control the narrative, just in time to manage the debris. Her smile was still perfectly intact, but her eyes were doing inventory, calculating how many guests had heard and how many of them would still write checks. She touched Derek's arm in a gesture that looked tender but communicated restraint more than affection. "Adam, I'm so glad you came," she said, performing warmth like a second language she'd learned phonetically. "But maybe you've had enough toasting for one evening." It was a retreat wrapped in politeness, Claire's signature move. She'd corner you in a conversation, and when you didn't collapse, she'd reframe the encounter as if you'd been the one who'd overstepped. I'd seen her use it on waitstaff, junior colleagues, and once on her own mother. Watching it fail against someone who'd memorized the playbook was its own quiet satisfaction. "Actually, Claire," Julia said, standing up and smoothing the front of her lavender dress with the same calm she'd used when she'd first explained the fellowship sabotage, "I think the toasts have been the most honest part of this wedding. You should hear what else we've been toasting." Claire's mask slipped. Just for a fraction of a second, the composed hostess warped into something colder and more familiar. The woman who'd once told me affection was a performance for people who lacked ambition. Then she recovered, but too slowly. The bridesmaid who'd whispered to Julia earlier was openly watching now, her expression no longer hiding her alliance. "I don't know what you mean," Claire said, her voice dropping half an octave, a tell I'd cataloged years ago when she'd lie about whose idea it was to cancel our vacations. Julia reached into her clutch and withdrew a folded piece of paper. It was worn at the edges, refolded many times, the way important documents become both treasure and burden. She didn't wave it around. She simply held it in her open palm like evidence waiting to be entered into record. "2 years ago, you sent an anonymous email to the Warren Fellowship Selection Committee claiming I'd plagiarized my portfolio proposal. You used a burner account, but the committee, because they're professionals, launched an investigation. I was cleared. They traced the message back to an IP address registered in your name at the firm where we both worked." The room had gone from quiet to the kind of silence that has its own pressure. Even the caterers had stopped where they stood holding trays of half-empty champagne flutes. Claire's face drained of color in a way no foundation could compensate for. "That's a lie," she whispered, but the whisper had no conviction. It was the voice of someone who'd been caught not by accident, but by the meticulous patience of a woman who'd waited 2 years for the right audience. "I have the letter from the committee," Julia continued, her voice steady and public now, the voice of a teacher, not a victim. "They apologized for the distress while making clear they knew exactly who sent the allegation. They kept it confidential to protect me, not you. I've carried it through every room you've put me in since, just in case you ever asked why I stayed. Tonight, you put me at a table with the one person in this room you can't control, someone who already survived you. So I'm finally giving you what you've been asking for without realizing it. Accountability, in front of witnesses. Claire turned to the crowd as if expecting support, but the faces she found were not allies. They were an audience that had just realized it had been watching the wrong performance. Her own mother, seated near the cake table, was staring at her with the specific exhaustion of a parent who'd long suspected their child had become something unrecognizable. Derek, the man who was supposed to defend her, had taken a literal step backward. His tie was now fully loosened, hanging like a white flag. Here's what the bride didn't understand. People will forgive mistakes, even cruelty, if they believe the person is trying to grow. But Claire had been growing only in her capacity to arrange rooms and people into evidence of her own rightness. The second that illusion cracked, so did every loyalty she'd purchased. "You're going to have to leave," Claire said, the words trembling but still reaching for authority. She looked at me. "Both of you." I picked up my whiskey glass and took a slow sip. "You invited me, Claire. You seated us together. You made the seating chart a weapon. Now you want to kick us out because we didn't bleed the way you planned." I set the glass down. "That's not how freedom works. You don't get to write the ending after you lost control of the story." Julia touched my arm. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of shared experience, the kind of solidarity that doesn't require discussion because the situation has already spoken. Together, we started walking toward the exit, not retreating, just leaving a room that had become too small for people who'd stopped pretending. But before we reached the door, Claire called out one last thing, not to me, but to Julia. A final throw of cruelty, desperate and revealing in its desperation. "Congratulate her on the dance, Adam," she said, her voice cracking. "But ask her why she's been sleeping in her car for the past month. That's what my sabotage really cost her." The silence that followed was different. This was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of a room realizing it had witnessed something unforgivable. Julia didn't turn around. Her hand tightened on my arm, and for the first time all evening, the calm she'd worn like armor seemed to be costing her something physical. I didn't ask. Not yet. I simply opened the door and let her walk into the night air, knowing that whatever story was waiting outside would be the real one. The one Claire had just handed us without understanding that she'd given the final piece of ammunition to the people she'd tried to destroy. Outside, the September air hit with the first honest temperature of the evening, cool enough to feel like relief, not escape. The barn's fairy lights twinkled behind us through the windows, still performing a celebration that had just been revealed as a fraud. Julia walked ahead of me, her heels clicking on the gravel parking lot with the same rhythm she'd used at the table. Controlled, deliberate, unwilling to let anyone hear the break. I didn't rush to catch up. Some revelations need a few steps to settle before words will fit around them. She stopped beside a faded blue sedan, not the kind of car an architect drives by choice, but the kind you drive when all the better options have been repossessed. The backseat was visible through the window, a folded blanket, a pillow still creased from use, a dry-cleaning bag with one lavender dress that looked very much like the backup she hadn't needed tonight. Claire's cruelty had been literal. Julia had been sleeping in her car for the past month, and the woman who designed every chair at that reception had seated her anyway, knowing exactly what kind of humiliation she was capping. "He wasn't supposed to say that," Julia said, her back still to me. "Derek. He was supposed to just stand there and look uncomfortable. That was his job." I waited. I'd learned in the years after Claire that silence sometimes does more work than anyone's best speech. Julia turned around. Her makeup had held, but the composure behind it was cracked in ways that the ballroom hadn't been allowed to see. She didn't just torpedo my fellowship. After I was cleared, she told the firm I'd been aggressive toward her. Unstable. It wasn't true. It was never true. But she had seniority, and I had a cleared investigation file that nobody cared enough to read. They let me go 3 months later. I lost the apartment because the fellowship was supposed to cover my student loans. It's a very boring, very predictable chain of dominoes that ends with a woman in a bridesmaid's dress sleeping at a rest stop. Her voice wasn't looking for sympathy. It was reciting facts the way you practice them so they stop hurting. That was the detail I hadn't expected. Claire hadn't just stolen Julia's career opportunity. She'd followed up. She'd ensured the destruction was complete, the way she'd once ensured I doubted every professional success I had while we were together. The pattern was so consistent it stopped being shocking and became simply clarifying. "What do you need tonight?" I asked. Julia blinked. It was clearly not the question she'd been preparing for. "What?" "I'm not going to ask if you're okay because you're not, and I'm not going to offer solutions you've already considered, so I'm asking what you need. A place to sleep that isn't a backseat. A breakfast tomorrow where nobody's performing. A phone number for a lawyer who once helped me untangle Claire from my lease and my credit. You pick. The rest can wait." She stared at me, and I watched the exhaustion of years of self-reliance war with the unfamiliar prospect of not having to fight alone. Then she laughed, not the surprised laugh from the dance floor, but something more worn, more honest. "You have a lawyer for that. You were only engaged. I lost a career." I had a lawyer for that because after I left Claire, a collections notice arrived for a credit card I never opened. She'd taken one out in my name during our last year together, for wedding deposits, she said, but the charges were for clothes, spa visits, and a trip to Miami she told me was a work conference. I paid it off, changed my numbers, and kept the lawyer on retainer. That's not a flex. That's just what it costs to survive someone who sees other people as furniture. Julia absorbed that. Then she said something I didn't expect. "I've been starting to think I was the only one." "You're not," I said. "There are probably 5 more people in that room who just haven't realized it yet. She collects us. You, me, Derek. He's furniture too. He just hasn't been replaced yet." We stood in the parking lot while the barn's music shifted to something slow enough for last dances. I could see the shape of the night changing, turning from a wedding into a story that would be told by the people who'd witnessed it, some version of it anyway. The version Claire would spin would make us villains, obviously. But there were too many guests who'd heard the truth, and secrets that big don't stay contained in barns with open bars. Julia unlocked her car and pulled out the pillow and blanket. She looked at me, then at the items in her arms. "If I take you up on that breakfast," she said, "I need to be clear about something. I'm not a project. I'm not a redemption story. I'm not the woman who gets rescued at a wedding and falls in love with the ex-boyfriend because he did one decent thing in a room full of indecent people. I've had 2 years of being the cautionary tale. I'm not going to be the romantic subplot either." "I wasn't asking for a role," I said. "I was offering a breakfast, and a couch if you want it. My apartment has a guest room that my sister uses twice a year, and the rest of the time it's just storage for books I'll never read. You're not a project, but you're also not sleeping in your car tonight, not after what just happened in there." She considered this. Then she handed me the pillow, a small, deliberate transfer of weight that meant more than any contract either of us had signed that night. "Breakfast first. Then I'll decide if you're as decent as you sounded in your toast." She paused. "What was your toast exactly?" I was too busy trying not to cry to hear the words. I told her. She listened, and when I finished, she said, "That's not a toast. That's a closing argument. Same thing when you're dealing with Claire." We drove separately to a 24-hour diner on the highway, the kind that doesn't ask questions, just refills coffee and lets the fluorescent lights do their indifferent work. Over pancakes and eggs that had no business being as good as they were, Julia told me the rest. The fellowship committee had encouraged her to file a formal complaint against Claire. She'd hesitated because she believed somewhere that the woman who'd once been her colleague had a conscience that might eventually activate. The wedding seating chart was her final evidence that it didn't. "Derek looked scared," she said, stirring her coffee. "Not at the end. At the beginning, when you first danced with me. He looked at Claire like he'd just seen a version of her he hadn't been shown yet. That's how she works. She shows people edited footage. Derek's been watching the highlight reel. Tonight he saw the deleted scenes. Do you think he'll leave? I don't know, but it doesn't matter. She'll replace him, or he'll stay and become the next version of furniture. The machine doesn't care about its parts." She looked at me. "That's why I didn't want to be the romantic subplot. Because if I attach my recovery to you, then I'm just trading one script for another, and I've been in Claire's script long enough." That was the moment I understood the full shape of the evening. It wasn't about a dance or a toast or even the public exposure of a cruel woman at her own wedding. It was about two people who had been written into the wrong story recognizing each other and deciding, quietly over pancakes, to start writing their own. One final detail sealed it. As we left the diner, Julia's phone buzzed. It was a text from the bridesmaid who'd whispered to her earlier. The message read, "She's been telling everyone you two had an affair before the breakup. Half the room doesn't believe her. The other half doesn't care. You won." Julia showed me the screen. Then she turned off the phone and put it in her pocket. "I didn't want to win," she said. "I just wanted to stop losing." The sun was starting to soften the horizon. I drove her to my apartment, gave her the guest room key, and told her breakfast was at 9 unless she wanted to sleep longer. She looked at the room, small, clean, full of bookshelves, and said, "This is the first night in a month I won't wake up and remember where I am." That sentence wasn't romance. It was recovery, and that, as it turned out, was the foundation for everything that came after. Months later, Julia and I would sometimes meet for coffee and laugh about the sheer absurdity of that night. Two people who'd been cast as supporting characters in someone else's drama, then refused to read the lines. Claire's marriage lasted 14 months. Derek eventually called me, not to apologize, but to ask how I'd known. I told him, "You don't know. You just stop ignoring what the room is telling you." Julia found a new firm, one that read her portfolio instead of Claire's rumors. She still stays in my guest room occasionally, not because she can't afford a place now, but because some spaces become safe before they become permanent. And that's the thing about the chairs people assign you. You can sit in them and shrink, or you can turn them into the best seat in the room by simply refusing to be the person they expected. But here's the question I still turn over. How many people are